Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World, is Vidya Dehejia. She is a Barbara Stoller Miller Professor of Indian and South Asian Art at Columbia University in New York. She has received a Padma Bhushan for her accomplishments, and her work ranges from the Buddhist art of the BCE centuries to the esoteric temples of North India, from the sacred bronzes of South India to art under the British Raj. She has written books, The Thief Who Stole My Heart, The Material Life of Sacred Bronzes from Chola India, and The Unfinished, Stone Covers at Work on the Indian Continent, and various other books. I hand it over to you.
Perhaps I'll start by welcoming William Dalrymple to Goa, since I consider myself a Goa resident at least half the year. And thanks, of course, to the Goa Arts and Literature Festival for this opportunity to have a conversation with William Dalrymple. You all know his book right now, the latest one, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. It has got rave reviews across the world. And I'm going to read you some of those reviews. But just before that, let's take a quick look at the structure of this book of 484 pages. But you can relax, because the actual book itself, the text itself, is only 300 pages. The remaining almost 200 is notes, footnotes, and bibliography and other end matter. His book, he explains, tells the story of the diffusion of transformative Indian ideas, first around Asia, then around the wider world. He clarifies that further, and let me just read what he says. For a millennium and a half, from about 250 BCE to 1200 CE, India was a confident exporter of its own diverse civilization, creating around it an empire of ideas which developed into a tangible Indosphere, where its cultural influence was predominant. During this period, the rest of Asia was the willing and even eager recipient of a startlingly comprehensive mass transfer of Indian soft power in religion, art, music, dance, textiles, technology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, mythology, language, and literature. Quite a claim, you might say, and perhaps you understand why the footnotes amount to all of 100 pages. More on footnotes later if I have a chance. For those of you not yet familiar with the book, let me take you through the book's main themes, which are 4 in number. One is Buddhism and its movement into China, primarily via Central Asia. As he writes, Buddhism was India's prime export to China. The second is ancient India's extensive trade contacts with the West, with Aden and from there on to the Roman Empire, a fascinating story that you'll hear about from him in a few minutes. The third theme of the book is the movement to Southeast Asia, of gods, myths, language, literature, through merchants and traders, Buddhist monks, and Hindu Brahmins. With more and more of us all traveling to the East rather than to the Western Europe these days, many of you have probably encountered the temples of Thailand, of Indonesia, and Cambodia. This is a fascinating chapter in the history of movements, movement of peoples and ideas. The fourth and final section of his book traces the westward movement through Arab intervention of concepts like zero and the numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Mathematics, algebra, calculus, geometry were transformed and able to advance rapidly once the cumbersome Roman numerals used in the West were replaced by the 1 to 9 number system. Just think of the nuisance value of adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing with Roman numerals. Take the number 28. It was written as XXV111 or III instead of the simplified 28. 169 was written as CLXIX instead of just 169. You can understand what a difference our number system that we take for granted would make to mathematical advances. So let me go on to a few reviews. The Independent. With his new book, historian William Dalrymple has written a lucid and compelling account of why it is India, not China, to which we owe the most important developments in human civilization. A multifarious and engaging narrative which, like Indian trade, takes us in many directions. The Literary Review. A more masterful and accessible survey of a world-changing traffic in commodities, creeds, scientific insights, and artistic conventions would be hard to find. Financial Times. An outstanding history of the trade routes that linked a civilization's wealth and wisdom to the world beyond. The Guardian. Dalrymple is a born storyteller with a wonderful facility for expounding complex events with verve and clarity. Like any successful synthesis, his text draws on vast reading as well as a keen eye for telling details. And then the bookish elf, I love that name. The Golden Road is more than just a history book. It's a paradigm-shifting work that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about ancient civilizations and India's place in the world. A mind-blowing panorama of India's forgotten role at the beating heart of the ancient world. I could read you dozens more reviews, but let's move to India. Hindustan Times. History as taught in India is a 19th century construct that is heavily Delhi-centric, ignoring the coastal zones from which bold sailors sailed all the way to Aden. Modern India has not told her ancient tale well, either to herself or to the world, a task newly accomplished by William Dalrymple's book. Dalrymple has pulled off a great service to the history of the ancient world, which is largely unknown out west, and even to many in India. It would be useful for me to mention a review from a scholar who appears to belong to the field of subaltern studies. One such scholar speaks of your bias, William, in favor of knowledge of the head over knowledge of the hand. But of course, this is not a book about the history of an entire period. Williams is a targeted subject matter. The scholar speaks rightly of cultures encountering each other and borrowing from each other. He quotes Sheldon Pollock, whom William also cites, talking about global networks of begging, borrowing, stealing, imitating, and emulating. I'm sure that William would agree on that comment on the meeting of cultures. There's this entire swirl of interactions, economic, spiritual, and cultural. Yet this reviewer from the field of subaltern studies is ultimately complimentary, if reluctantly so. He writes, if we take Dalrymple's Indocentrism with a fistful of salt, The Golden Road is a great, eminently readable book. And then his final words, my hope is that it will be the last of the great books in its genre. Very clearly, he doesn't care for the genre of popular history, which is becoming more and more popular these days. Ultimately, here's what scholars say about a popular historian versus an academic historian. That history is a serious business. That in order to make a text engaging, they say that popular historians remove a lot of the unknowns that exist in history. That nuances are lacking, which is not the case in this particular case. I should also add that many such critics are opponents of the current political ethos. They worry about the book playing into politics, and that I think is a genuine and justified worry. Here's how I see the situation, William. I would say that you are not afraid to join the dots. Might you perhaps say it yourself? Might you agree with my assessment? William, I'm sure you realize that your comments about a generation of Indian academic historians failing to engage with the public has sparked controversy. You're right, of course. But academics counter again that history is a serious matter. They write that popular historians synthesize the work of academic historians to make it enjoyable to a reader. They speak of the fact, which will amuse you, that popular historians are supported by a network of trade publishers, literary festivals, and mostly upper caste mentors. True, but what's wrong with that? By the way, there are murmurs on the quiet that serious historians have not been asked to write reviews. There is a sort of resentment about that. Serious historians in India, I mean. So, let me start by asking you to say a few words about the title of your book, The Golden Road.
First of all, before I say anything else, I should say that Vidya and I have been on stage many times before, but it has always been me as the chela questioning the guru. And I think this is the first time in maybe 10 or 11 or 12 times on together that I've had the honor of Vidya commenting on my work. So thank you very much for coming today. I've often come to see Vidya in Goa as well as in New York and sat at her feet, sometimes on her sofa in Goa, going through Chola inscriptions that she was reading for her latest work on Chola bronzes, a fantastic series of books. And it was sitting, working through Vidya's wonderful works at the beginning of COVID that really this book began to form in my head. So I owe you a huge debt. The title is specifically aimed to counter this very popular notion of the Silk Road. And I should perhaps straight away put up this map, which you see in a wide variety of forms like this. It's a map which moves from the Mediterranean on the left, Alexandria, Tyre, Antioch, these classical names on the Mediterranean, and through a series of dotted lines moving horizontally across Asia, passes through Anatolia, through Persia, through Central Asia, and through China until arriving close to the China Sea, which you can't quite see at the end. Could we move the, maybe I can do this, slightly over so you can see, no, we're losing slightly the edge of it, but to the end of the Silk Road in Loyang. And for example, at the moment, if you were to go to the British Museum, there's a wonderful exhibition called The Silk Roads, which contains a map very like this. 40 or 50 books a year are published in the Silk Road in different areas of the globe. And as you can see with this map, it's all very well, but it completely omits India from the picture, India is a complete absence on this map. There's the Himalayas and then nothing else. Even the dotted line coming around the bottom, which is sometimes called the Maritime Silk Road, which is a new addition to these maps, just bypasses India. It goes between Sri Lanka and India, heads off, and finally arrives at its destination at Gaza, improbably. It's my contention in this book that as far as the classical period is concerned, this map is more or less a lie. It does not represent any sort of reality that reflects the patterns of trade of the classical period. Because the simple truth is that Rome and China were unaware of each other's existence. Vaguely, there are a couple of references in both directions to the possible existence of a vast power in the West or the East. But no direct trade mission is ever known to have gone from Rome to China or vice versa. No diplomatic contact was made. But at the same time that there was this absence of any actual classical connect between Rome and China, India and China from the first century were in close and regular contact. From the moment, if you remember in your literature classes, when Octavius defeats Antony Cleopatra, Cleopatra famously puts an asp to her breast, and Octavius, as Augustus, his imperial name, seizes Roman Egypt. From that moment, India and the Roman world have a border, because it's only 2 months sailing from here, from the Goan coast, or from Kerala, or from Gujarat, or from the mouth of the Indus in Sindh, to Berenike, or the ports of Roman Egypt. And propelled by the monsoon, sailors from the first century began making not just regular trips, but annual trips. Strabo, a Greek-Roman geographer based in Alexandria, talks of fleets of 250 vessels waiting in Myos Hormos, one of the main ports of the Red Sea, to go together in great fleets to India. And then India, with this extraordinary providence of having a monsoon which blows very fast in one direction for 6 months of the year, then reverses itself and blows back again, allowing sailors who traveled from Goa or Kerala or Gujarat to Egypt to come back again equally fast. This unique property of the winds has meant that India has always been a coastal nation with strong trading contacts, which is why today there are still great colonies of Goans in East Africa, in the Gulf, because the winds have dictated it as such. And from the time of the Indus Valley, we have records of sailing expeditions going backwards and forwards. But these enormously accelerate at the time of the Roman Empire, and there's no better indication of this. So what this map is it's a new map from the Archaeology Department of Oxford University, and it shows the distribution of Roman coin hoards. And inevitably there are massive hoards of Roman coins found all over Europe, all over Italy, France, Spain, across the Mediterranean coast, north and south, east and west, and down the Nile. And then no Roman coins in China, no Roman coins along the supposed route of the Silk Road, but enormous quantities of Roman coins found all over Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and the entire Indian coast, and Sri Lanka as well. So we've always assumed, I think, that the Silk Road is this ancient idea with an established past. In reality, it's an idea invented by a German geographer in 1877. Baron von Richthofen wrote of the Seidenstraßen in a book about a colonial railway he was planning from Berlin to Peking. The idea enters the English language in 1936, and it's only in the 1980s, when I'm at college, that you first get talk of the Silk Road's carpet shops in Istanbul start to call themselves the Silk Road Carpet Shop, and bars in Tashkent and so on. And then the Chinese state takes this up, and we have a whole series of often state-sponsored shows, exhibitions, conferences, scholarly articles, books in large numbers, which turn the Silk Road from a speculative idea. That's much better. If you look at this map, the orange are the Roman coins, Italy, Britain, the Balkans, the Mediterranean coast, a couple in Aden, a couple in Afghanistan, an enormous orange splodge all over coastal India where Roman coins have been discovered. So my contention is that we need to, for this classical period at least, throw out this nonsense about Silk Roads, which didn't exist until the Mongols did create a through route right through the middle of Asia, and focus on the maritime power of India. And that's the first idea at the beginning of the book. And I talk about the spread of Buddhism from UP, from Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, and Sarnath, and the role that Ashoka plays in starting the Buddhist missions. Ashoka sends out what he calls Dharma ministers into the Hellenistic world. With the Buddhist mission, you begin to get Buddhism spreading first through India with wonderful caves like Bhaja, where Vidya, as a young graduate student with her husband Jay, camped out to study these early Buddhist monasteries in the, what period? When were you doing this? Early 70s? Yeah, late 60s. Vidya was on to studying all this as her PhD. And you begin to get the wall paintings, first of all in Cave 9 and 10, then the rest of Ajanta and Pittalkora and various other sites. And Buddhism spreads to Sri Lanka, where Ashoka sends his son Mahinda. We've recently discovered Mahinda's stupa in Rajagala, the center of Sri Lanka. And this is the extraordinary map, which should be more widely known. If there were more Buddhists living today in in India, I'm sure we'd have this much more prominently known than we do. But it is in a matter of 400 or 500 years, Buddhism spreads from the Gangetic Plain right through what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan, into Central Asia, across China into Mongolia and Siberia, through China to Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and then down to the whole of Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and even the Philippines. So there is an extraordinary spread of not just Buddhism as a religion, but also a whole panoply of Indian learning and Indian ideas which spread with it. And so ideas like of time, like the yugas, ideas of geography, like Jambudvipa, these pass along with the Prakrit and Sanskrit texts across Southeast Asia, across Mongolia, through China, giving India a vast area of influence that I call the Indosphere in this book. And the scale and the amplitude of the Indosphere is still expanding. This is a wonderful head of a Buddha, which was found as recently as 2 years ago in the Red Sea port of Berenike. It's sort of vaguely Gandharan in style, but sculpted in Proconnesian marble from the Marmara Sea. It has sun rays coming from the back of the Buddha's head as if he's some sort of solar deity like Mithras or Sol Invictus. But most extraordinary of all, this extraordinary face, this beautiful sculpture, was found in a temple to the goddess Isis on the Red Sea coast of Berenike, erected by an Indian sea captain to thank for his safe arrival in this part of the world. And by the 1st century, we have a map based on the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is this very valuable source, which talks about Goa and the whole of the west coast of India and the many ports which were on this coast. And it's very clear from this text, written in the 1st century, that India was as familiar to Roman sailors as any distant port in the Mediterranean. This was very much part of the world that the Romans knew, so much so that they needed a guide to tell them what particular products they should be bringing, what they can sell, what they can buy, and so on. We've forgotten the nuances of this, and yet, as Vidya well knows, in the Amaravati sculptures, and these particular ones are in the Chennai Central Museum, where they're atrociously badly displayed behind perspex and almost impossible to see. But if you go down on your hands and knees, you can see images what look very like Ethiopian envoys with cornrow hair, and the tall, elegant figure on the right offering gifts. And there's a whole world of Red Sea trade that we have forgotten, but which is here in the art if we look for it. There's also documents. This is a new document which appeared in Vienna about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, called the Muziris Papyrus. And it's a freak survival from the Egyptian desert of one shipping invoice, recording a shipment which was sent from Muziris, in what is now Kerala, past this coast to Alexandria. And what's important about this document is it contains the figures. And what amazed the economic historians who've been studying this is the value of these cargoes leaving India and arriving in Alexandria. Now, the kind of things that they're selling are illustrated in this mosaic in Sicily, presumably erected by a merchant who was something to do with this trade. In the center, you have a figure representing India, which seems to be based on a yakshi from some early Buddhist sculpture. Here she is, this voluptuous figure. And what has she got on her knees? She's got silk, because the Periplus says, where did the Romans get silk from? Not from China. They got it from the coast of Gujarat. And if Rome and China ever did meet, it's probably in the bazaars of early Gujarat, Barbaricum, that they did so. But you also see an elephant, a tiger, circus animals. I don't know if any of you watched the latest Gladiator 2 when it came out, but there are exotic beasts there. In the case of Gladiator 2, a rhinoceros from the Red Sea trade turning up in the Colosseum. There's also behind the figure of India, she's holding an ivory tusk. The ivory trade was clearly one of the most profitable exports, and she's got pepper vines hanging from behind her, pepper being another of the major exports that's referred to in the Muziris Papyrus. And what the Muziris Papyrus has is not just the extraordinary price, because it's very clear that your coastal Indian ancestors were ripping off my poor Western ancestors something rotten, that we have receipts for a tiny quantity of black Indian pepper that turned up at the Hadrian's Wall at Vindolanda, and they were charging something a complete rip-off, something like 5 denarii by the time we got as far as Northumbria. But in the Muziris Papyrus, you could have a single shipment, this one shipment for which we have the details, which contained pepper, ivory, malabathrum, which was an Indian product used in Roman perfumery, and cotton. So valuable was the contents of this one container that if it did successfully reach Alexandria, it would have made enough profit, according to the figures on this invoice, at least, to buy any estate in Roman Egypt, or indeed in central Tuscany, and have enough spare change to join the Roman Senate. So one large successful shipment of, I think there's something like 20 tons of ivory mentioned in this document. One successful shipment like that could have turned you into the Elon Musk of Roman Egypt. God help us, but there you go. And we also have, even more excitingly, a column for the amount taken by the Roman customs. And my colleague Andrew Wilson's of All Souls, Oxford, has calculated that maybe as much as a quarter of the Roman imperial budget came from the customs take on the Red Sea coast. That so huge was the profits being made at Berenike and Myasomos by the Roman state, that it paid for maybe a quarter or even a third of the Roman roads, the Rhine frontier forts, the forts across the Sahara Desert. This whole military apparatus of the Roman Empire is partially funded by the profits of the imports and the taxation upon them. And this is similar in reverse, just to move forward many centuries. The British Empire made many of its profits from the import of Chinese tea, and the duty on it paid for about a quarter of British imperial costs, to give you a comparative figure from the 19th century. So this was hugely important to the Romans. It's the reason the Romans didn't ban the trade, because Pliny, sitting in Rome in the early 1st century, complains that India has become the sink of all the precious metals in the world. And we have other evidence. For example, Nero's mistress, Lolina Paulina, who sounds like she's a displaced Punjabi, turns up at parties in Rome with Indian diamonds, onyx, sardonyx, all these expensive Indian gems all over her person, her tummy, even her shoes. And she brought the receipts to the parties to show other guests how much they cost. So it's not just, this behavior doesn't just happen in the Delhi wedding season. It's an old feature. So we're beginning to get a picture of the enormous Indian influence on the economy and the imports of Rome. But it went in two directions. In return for these exports like ivory and pepper, there are items like these gorgeous Greco-Alexandrian beakers turning up at the Bagram Horde in Afghanistan. We have examples of the influence of Coptic papyri on Gandharan wall painting. These are the painters of Miran, which seems to have a very similar iconography to the bottom papyrus, which shows Christ and his disciples. The top one is Buddha and his disciples. So you have the iconography crossing religions and turning up unexpectedly. But the biggest example of change is that this famous moment when Buddhist art moves, which you've written about so extensively, Vidya, about when Buddhist art moves from the aniconic, where the Buddha is represented as a flaming pillar, such as the top left, a stupa, bottom left, or the wheel of law, top right. And suddenly, in the 1st century AD, he becomes a human figure, often draped in something that looks like a toga or a mation. And some scholars believe it's based on a figure of Apollo, but certainly you get in Afghanistan and Gandharan art in Pakistan these very classicized faces for the Bodhisattvas. Look at the figure on the right. It could be a Roman emperor, and indeed compare Augustus on the left, a statue in Rome, to the drapery of the Bodhisattva in the center here. And then the book goes, I just briefly rush through it, tracing the push of Buddhism into Gansu, into Western China, then through to the East, Buddhist art being reproduced often more crudely in China, Gandharvas and Apsaras that seem at home in Ajanta turning up in Kizil and these other wonderful Central Asian sites. And then we have a whole section about Xuanzang, this famous traveler. The oldest among you would have known him as Huan Sang in your old textbooks, coming to Nalanda, the great Indian university, where, as you can see from the next slide, the same quadrangles that you find both in Islamic madrasas and later in Christian Western universities such as Paris or Oxford or Cambridge and ultimately in Harvard. These courtyards with a central courtyard, a cloister garth, and scholars' rooms left and right, 2 stories off the central courtyard. This plan for a scholarly establishment seems to start in India, in the Buddhist universities like Nalanda, the Mahaviharas, to find its way to the madrasas of Afghanistan, hence to Persia, hence to Egypt, hence to North Africa. We have a little bit more on the Buddhist, the story of how this extraordinary Chinese empress, the Empress Wu. Should we talk about that?
The Silk Route, or the Silk Road. I do agree that it's absolutely irrelevant to the Roman Empire. But I wonder whether you have underestimated the importance of the Central Asian route from India to China, the route that traverses both sides of the Tarim River and across the Taklamakan Desert.
That I don't dispute at all, yeah.
It is not,
Yeah.
certainly is not a silk route, but the importance of that route has to be acknowledged. I mean, sort of saying it's a Central Asian route, we won't call it the Silk Route, arose by any other name, perhaps?
It's this idea that there's an east-west motorway moving from Xi'an to the Mediterranean that I object to. I have no problem at all with the idea of course, I mean, not only no problem, but clearly it's crucially important. Xuanzang does this route along the Tarim Basin.
And so I wonder whether one might also take a look at Buddhist texts, which is something that you haven't had the time to do perhaps in this book. But the Buddhist texts that moved with Buddhist monks to China, so the vast majority of early Indian Buddhist texts, which were composed in one or other form of Prakrit and written in more than one Indic script, have been lost. What do we have? How are we resurrecting early Buddhism? We have Chinese translations of those lost texts. And let us consider the fact that the earliest known dated translation of a Buddhist text into Chinese dates to the year 148 CE, and it was translated by a Parthian prince turned Buddhist, Anshigao.
There's a whole chapter on Anshigao and Kumarajiva, crucially
so
important.
this large-scale translation occurred, and then you talk about Kumarajiva, of course. But here's the point that is an interesting point that I think many people may not know, that very few early Indian Buddhist texts have survived in their original form in any Indian language or script. Much of what we know today from early Buddhist texts comes from Chinese translations. Those Chinese translations in turn were translated into Tibetan. And then much later, those Tibetan texts were retranslated into Sanskrit, extending almost into the 20th century. It's quite a circle in which that whole thing went. So that's the only reason why, yes, there's no Silk Route, but the Central Asian route is crucial, very much used and very crucial. So would you like to keep going?
Sure, shall I keep going? So another figure that is, I think, not well known at all in India is this figure Wu Zetian, but she's a crucial figure of cultural transference. She is a Buddhist young woman who gets recruited to the harem of the first Tang Emperor Taizong. She is 15, he is 60. And she's obviously an incredible figure. She somehow manages to avoid the fate of most young concubines, which is when the older man dies, they get shoved into a nunnery. She manages to jump into the bed of his son, Gaozong. So we have on the left Taizong, Wu Zetian, who looks rather an old boot in this picture, but looks rather more alluring in the Chinese soap opera, which has come out lately and been there's something like a sort of 200 part, rather like the Mahabharata in the 1980s here. The story of Wu Zetian has become a 200-part Chinese story. And this extraordinary woman makes Buddhism briefly the state religion of China. A crucial moment whereby it doesn't last long, but for this brief period, Taoism and Confucianism are demoted, and Buddhism, an Indian religion developed on the banks of the Ganges, becomes the court religion during the reign of Wu Zetian. And this is, if you like, the high watermark of Indian influence in China. Never again will Indians be so extraordinarily influential. And we know that Wu employed many graduates from Nalanda, or monks who had certainly been to Nalanda at various points in their life. And we have a whole series of Indians taking official positions in the court in China. For example, a character called Siddhartha Gautama, you can't get a more Buddhist name than that, taking over the astronomy bureau in Xi'an. So India has this moment. And the same time as this is happening, the same is happening in Southeast Asia. We saw in the early part of the book how important the Roman trade was during the classical period. Rome falls in the 5th century, and suddenly those Red Sea ports, which have been so crucial for for trade between the two and the transmission of ideas and artistic currents between the two, they close down. And what happens is that Indian merchants, particularly the Tamil trading guilds that you've written so much about in these inscriptions, the people like the 500, pivot eastwards at this period. And you suddenly see a vast increase. Just as the Roman trade diminishes on the west coast, you get a sudden increase of Indian journeys coming out of ports like Nagapattinam and Mahabalipuram to Java, to Cambodia, to the Mekong Delta, through the Malacca Straits. And we have records of touchstones of Tamil gold workers turning up at Bujang in Malaysia, in Thailand, at various sites, early sites in Vietnam and Cambodia, and references in the Jataka tales and in the Ramayana to the Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. So having got gold pouring in during the Roman period, when that stops, these trading guilds have to look for new sources of gold in Southeast Asia. And the result is an extraordinary cultural transformation in Southeast Asia. This is a picture of a boat from Borobudur, the sort of boat that you might have expected coming between the two. But at the same time as that's being sculpted, we're getting the wheels of law turning up in the mysterious kingdom of Dvaravati, which is now early Thailand. In the Bujang Peninsula in Malaysia, we get images of Buddhist monks, lingams, yonis, images of Lord Shiva turning up, but most dramatically of all in the Mekong Delta, where the Mekong debouches out into the sea. We get these extraordinary canals built by early Khmer rulers, and if you follow them, you end up at Angkor Borei, where one of the earliest temples in Southeast Asia can be found, earliest Hindu temples, and inside that temple was found now in the Phnom Penh Museum, this extraordinary series of Khmer sculptures of Lord Vishnu. But what's interesting is that from the beginning, they're not anything that could be confused with a sculpture in Tamil Nadu or in the Andhra coast. Already they come fully fledged in a Khmer style that could never be confused. And from the beginning, the kind of Hinduism that develops in Southeast Asia is slightly different. For example, here we have Jayavarman II, one of the early Khmer kings, showing himself as Lord Vishnu. In the top right picture, you can see him holding a conch and a discus. Are there any images in this country of Tamil kings as Lord Shiva or as...
No, that is entirely... That's entirely a Southeast Asian concept of the Devaraja.
The Devaraja, the god king. And you have these images of a local chieftain. He's surrounded by the 6th century by Brahmins who are Sanskrit literate. They introduce the Tamil Brahmi script, the sometimes called Pallava Grantha, which is the southern form of Brahmi, developed for the use on palm leaf, so these curvilinear lines that don't rip the palms. And as you can see with this picture, they're pouring water over the king in an Abhisheka ceremony. And at this period, you suddenly find kings whose grandfather being called Kodunga, or a Southeast Asian name, suddenly taking the names Mullavarman, protected by, or Suryavarman, protected by the sun. These Sanskrit titles. So you have the spread very rapidly of Sanskrit kingship. You have the landscape transforming. So you have the names of Indian cities reappearing. You have a new Kurukshetra in Laos, a new Ayodhya in Thailand. And most mysteriously of all, the possibility, though it's etymologically controversial, that Mekong could be Ma Ganga in Khmer. And so you have a new Ganga even flowing through the middle of Southeast Asia, which itself is sacralized at the near north of Angkor Wat. You have these yonis and lingams carved into the riverbank near the source of the one of the sources of the Mekong. And very soon after that, you get the first temples in Southeast Asia taking specifically forms related to the forms of Indian temples often in Tamil Nadu. So the left, we've got the famous Shore Temple at Mamallapuram. On the right, a temple at Gedong Songo in Java that has a similar profile, not identical though. And look how again that you have the Southeast Asian eaves around this temple. You have the Ramayana appearing at Prambanan, incredible 240 part episode by episode masterpiece, a transcription of the Ramayana into stone earlier than any similar sequence in India. You get the largest Buddhist temple built very much on the sort of design you get at Khazaria in Bihar, but here at Borobudur in Java in this extraordinary mandala form. And finally, by the 12th century, the largest Hindu temple ever built, Angkor Wat, built not in India, but in Cambodia. And arguably the largest and most successful militarily Hindu empire is not the Guptas, but the Khmers. Though don't tell that to Mr. Modi. So you have the fact that the largest Hindu empire might not have been in India is something that is certainly worth considering. And the Angkor Wat, this vast structure, 4 times the size of the Vatican City within the outer moat. Then finally we get to the final part of the book, which is the westward passage. Vidya, I'm sure we'll have all sorts of comments.
I only want to, a quote from your book, which immediately relates to what you've just been speaking about. I find it very inspiring, and so why don't I read it? It's very short, but it's very meaningful, where you've said, for more than 1,000 years, India was a garden that issued seeds that once planted elsewhere flowered in new, rich, and unexpected ways. It is such a quotable quote, and it applies immediately to this. I had to read back to you what you've written in the book.
Very flattering.
Yeah.
So just to canter to the end, something that many people know in this country, but bizarrely no one knows outside India. Everyone in the West is brought up knowing about Pythagoras and Archimedes. Most kids in America or Britain will know about Archimedes in his bath shouting Eureka by the age of 6 or 7. But no one in the West has ever heard of Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta, mathematicians of equal importance in world history, arguably of greater importance, because we don't use the Greek numbers or the Latin numbers today. We use the Indian numbers, but we call them in the West Arabic numbers, because the West got them from the Arab world, but it's been forgotten now that those same numbers came originally from India. And here we have in inscriptions the first 0, K127 in Siem Reap in the museum near Angkor, this central dot on the second line between the sort of 2 tadpoles. That is the earliest dated 0 in the world. No one's claiming that those ideas were dreamt in Southeast Asia, but they spread along with Hinduism and Hindu kingship off to the west, off to the east. And then by the 8th century, you've got the earliest 0 with our version of 0, the polo mint 0, with the hole in the middle. That appears in Gwalior. an oddly mundane inscription about the number of marigolds that someone has to give to the temple, but this crucial moment where we get the 0 that everyone in the world uses today. You can argue that the Indian number system is the nearest thing the world has today to a universal language. And yet no one in the West knows it came from India. No one knows the names Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta, who played such an important role in defining these. And here is a map of how these ideas travel. You start with Brahmi, then there's the Gwalior inscription that I just showed you of the marigolds, and then it goes in 3 different directions. It goes through the Sanskrit Devanagari that continues in this country, the East Arabic numbers that are still used today in Egypt and Iraq and so on, and Saudi, and then crucially the West Arabic numbers developed in Morocco and Islamic Spain that by the 16th century become the numbers used on every mobile phone, every computer, all over the world, and they are an Indian invention. If I was in charge of Indian cultural soft power, I wouldn't have International Yoga Day, although it would be very nice to have that, but to focus on this. This is arguably India's greatest gift to the world, an extraordinary contribution to mankind. How does it get out of India and travel westwards? Well, improbably through a Disney character. Hands up who's seen the Disney Aladdin here. Go on, admit it. You've all watched it with your grandchildren or your nephews and nieces. So Jafar, the villain of Aladdin, is actually a historical character. Jafar al-Barmakid, who is from a family that become the hereditary viziers of Baghdad, but before that, they are the hereditary abbots of the Buddhist monastery of Naubahar in Balkh in Afghanistan, who convert to Islam but are Sanskrit literate. And when they reach power in Baghdad in the 8th century, they call for the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta to be brought to Baghdad, and there they are translated. There are a couple of unsuccessful early attempts by somebody called Al-Fazari to render this very complex Sanskrit verse, because Aryabhatta, as well as writing with incredible density in Sanskrit, writes in poetry so it can be memorized by students. The old Indian rote learning is an old tradition. It's only 2 generations later when Al-Khwarizmi, who comes from Khwarazm, and writes this book, the compendious book of calculation by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation, that the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta are successfully translated into simple, clear, and immediately comprehensible Arabic prose. And this book gets much, much copied across the entire Islamic world, becomes the basis of Islamic mathematics, and gets a nickname because the compendious book of calculation by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation is a bit of a mouthful. It is known popularly as Al-Jabr, which gives us our word, algebra. While Al-Khwarizmi's name gives us our word, algorithm. So when you read about Facebook and the Google algorithm and all the rest of it, this is all starts off here in India with these series of ideas. And they travel through the Islamic world, along with chess, another Indian invention that takes root and travels westwards. So that, just to show on this map, so Sindh is where the embassy bringing the works, a book that is known in the Arab world as the Great Sindh Hind, which seems to be a compilation of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta's work. It's brought to Baghdad, where it's translated by Al-Khwarizmi, who comes from Khwarazm, down to Baghdad to translate it. Then that translation goes across the Islamic world through Egypt, right up to Islamic Spain, and it is in Islamic Spain that the first Christian monks discover the Indian number system. And yet, as late as the 12th century, Europe is still sticking to the Latin numbers. Then an extraordinary thing happens. Pisa, a city-state, great trading nation, establishes a colony and a trading station on the coast of Algeria. And the notary who founds the peace and trading station takes his kids. And just as my kids went to school in Delhi and learnt some Hindi, so this kid, the son of the notary, learns Arabic and learns Arabic maths at school as a matter of course, as any kid would do by this period. Luckily for us, that kid is Fibonacci. And Fibonacci goes back to Italy in the 12th century, and he writes the Book of Numbers, the text that effectively takes the work of Al-Khwarizmi and translates it now into Latin. So it's a relay race. We've started with Aryabhatta in Pataliputra. We've moved to Brahmagupta sitting in Mount Abu. Those works get taken to Baghdad, where Al-Khwarizmi translates them into Arabic. They then go to Algeria, where Fibonacci takes it to Italy. And Fibonacci's work comes to the attention of Frederick II, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who is a keen scholar and interested in maths and philosophical matters. And he takes Fibonacci and he introduces him, very importantly, Vidya, to a Scotsman, Michael Scott the Wizard. There's an important walk-on parts of Scots in this story too, I'm glad to say. Michael Scott, from my country, tells Fibonacci that it's all very well, this highfalutin theory that you've written, he says, it's not practical enough. And he encourages Fibonacci to write a second edition with double accounting, weights and measures, currency conversion, and so on. A book that could be used by merchants, trading, and this book becomes the Italian mathematical primer. It's used by the Medici when they're planning their bank, and it's the source, if you like, of, you could say, without stretching it too far, of the Medici banking fortunes. But more specifically, it's picked up by Renaissance painters such as Piero della Francesca, who was famous at the time as a mathematician. He writes 3 mathematical treatises, which his flatmate, Fra Luca Pacioli, takes to Milan and shares with his flatmate. The flatmate is Leonardo da Vinci. So this relay race has gone from from Bihar to Milan, from Aryabhatta to Leonardo da Vinci. And astonishingly, this is just a story which no one here really knows the full amplitude of. This vague sense that Aryabhatta is this important mathematician that you hear about at primary school, vague sense that Brahmagupta has something to do with zero. But these are major world achievements that this country should be trumpeting, and at the United Nations people should know this all over, and they don't. No one's ever heard of these people outside India. It's the extraordinary moment that this is so. Anyway, that's my rant. Trouble is, the next thing that happens, of course, is that these numbers end up in Britain, where they lead to the, you can say, the kind of accountancy that they lead to the East India Company, who bring it back to India in a form that you would prefer that it didn't. Anyway, that's the end of the story. Vidya, do you want to bring it to a...
I think that's fine. Thank you so much, William, for introducing the audience to this extraordinary story that you put together in the Golden Road. Sure, there will be, in a book of this size, of this complexity, of this richness, there are bound to be a few errors that have crept in. It would be quibbling about small little matters.
I had a quick look at Vidya's copy just before we went on stage, and there's little scribbled notes up and down the margins of things she spotted. The next edition, Vidya, Michelle.
One, though, that I'll mention only because it's so clear, and you've taken Kanishka and made him into Kasura and Caesar. And the writing is absolutely clear. It says, Raja di Raja Devaputra Kanishka, Maharaja. Kanishka, it's not Caesar, so we've got to correct that one.
the paperback is coming
Yeah.
out. We need the-
The only other thing that a few people who have actually read the book entirely, wonder about your what they call mixing of dates or going backwards and forwards. You do that, but it's an awfully difficult thing to avoid, I think, in this sort of a book. But you talked about Bhaja, for instance, and you've got a para about Bhaja, and then there's a para in between, and then another para about Bhaja. And the one in between cites something which everybody will imagine is Bhaja, but it's actually 700 years later. So there are these sort of things which, will crop up.
I'm not going to take on
But-
Vidya, who camped in Baja as a 21-year-old.
Anyway, thank you very much for introducing the audience to this absolutely monumental tome.